Babel-17 by Samuel R. Delany. Part 1. Rydra Wong. Here is the hub of ambiguity. Electric spectrums splash across the street. Equivocation knots the shadowed features of boys who are not boys. A quirk of darkness shrivels a full mouth to senility, or pares it to a razor edge, pours acid across the amber cheek, or smashes in the pelvic arch, and wells a dark clot oozing on a chest, dispelled with motion or a flare of light that swells the lips and dribbles them with blood. They say the same crowd surges up the street and surges down again, like driftwood borne, tidewise ashore and sucked away with backwash, only to slap into the sand again, only to be jerked out and spun away. Driftwood, me narrow hips and liquid eyes, the wide-flung shoulders and the rough-cast hands, the gray-faced jackals kneeling to their prey. The colors disappear at break of day, when stragglers toward the west river docks meet, young sailors ambling shipward on the street. From Prism and Lens, M.H. It's a port city. Here fumes miss the sky, the general thought. Industrial gases flush the evening with oranges, salmons, purples with too much red. West, ascending and descending transports, shuttling cargoes to stellar centers and satellites, lacerated the clouds. It's a rotten poor city, too, thought the general, turning the corner by the garbage-strewn curb. Since the invasion, 6 ruinous embargoes for months apiece had strangled this city, whose lifeline must pulse with interstellar commerce to survive. Sequestered, how could this city exist? 6 times in 20 years he'd asked himself that. Answer, it couldn't. Panics, riots, burnings, twice cannibalism. The general looked front to the silhouetted loading towers that jutted behind the rickety monorail to the grimy buildings. The streets were smaller here, cluttered with transport workers, loaders, a few stellar men in green uniforms, and the horde of pale, proper men and women who managed the intricate sprawl of customs operations. They are quiet now, intent on home or work, the general thought. Yet all of these people have lived for 2 decades under the invasion. They've starved during the embargoes, broken windows, looted, run screaming before fire hoses, torn flesh from a corpse's arm with decalcified teeth. Who is this animal man? He asked himself the abstract question to blur the lines of memory. It was easier, being a general, to ask about the animal man than about the woman who had sat in the middle of the sidewalk during the last embargo holding her skeletal baby at one leg, or the 3 scrawny teenage girls who had attacked him on the street with razors. She had hissed through brown teeth, the bar of metal glistening toward his chest. "Come here, beefsteak. Come get me lunch meat." He had used karate. Or the blind man who had walked up the avenue screaming. Pale and proper men and women now, who spoke softly, who always hesitated before they let an expression fix their faces, with pale, proper, patriotic ideas. Work for victory over the invaders. Alona Starr and Kip Ryak were great in Stellar Holiday, but Ronald Quar was the best serious actor around. They listened to highlights music, or did they listen, wondered the general, during those slow dances where no one touched. A position in customs was a good, secure job. Working directly in transport was probably more exciting and fun to watch in the movies. But really, such strange people. Those with more intelligence and sophistication discussed Rydra Wong's poetry. They spoke of the invasion often, with some 100 phrases consecrated by 20 years' repetition on newscasts and in the papers. They referred to the embargoes seldom, only by the one word. Take any of them, take any million. Who are they? What do they want? What would they say if given a chance to say anything? Rydra Wong has become this age's voice. The general recalled the glib line from a hyperbolic review. Paradoxical. A military leader with a military goal. He was going to meet Rydra Wong now. The streetlights came on, and his image glazed suddenly on the plate glass window of the bar. That's right, I'm not wearing my uniform now. He saw a tall, muscular man with the authority of half a century in his craggy face. He was uncomfortable in the gray civilian suit. Till age 30, the physical impression he had left with people was big and bumbling. Afterwards, the change had coincided with the invasion. It was massive and authoritarian. Had Rydra Wong come to see him at Administrative Alliance headquarters, he would have felt secure. But he was in Civies, not in Stellar Man Green. The bar was new to him, and she was the most famous poet in 5 explored galaxies. For the first time in a long while, he felt bumbling again. He went inside and whispered, "My God, she's beautiful, without even having to pick her from among the few other women. I didn't know she was so beautiful, not from the pictures." She turned to him. As the girl in the mirror behind the counter caught sight of him and turned away, stood up from the stool, smiled. He walked forward, took her hand, the words, "Good evening, Miss Wong," tumbling on his tongue till he swallowed them unspoken. And now she was about to speak. She wore copper lipstick, and the pupils of her eyes were like beaten discs of copper. "Babel-17," she said. "I haven't solved it yet, General Forrester." A knitted indigo dress, and her hair like fast water at night spilling over one shoulder. He said, "That doesn't really surprise me, Miss Wong." Surprise, he thought. She puts her hand on the bar, she leans back on the stool, hip moving in knitted blue, and with each movement, I am amazed, surprised, bewildered. Can I be this off guard, or can she really be that? But I've gotten further than you people at military have been able to. The gentle line of her mouth bowed with gentle laughter. "From what I've been led to expect of you, Miss Wong, that doesn't surprise me either." Who is she, he thought. He had asked the question of the abstract population. He had asked it of his own reflected image. He asked it of her now, thinking, no one else matters, but I must know about her. That's important. I have to know. "First of all, General," she was saying, "Babel-17 isn't a code." His mind skidded back to the subject and arrived teetering. "Not a code? But I thought cryptography had at least established." He stopped because he wasn't sure what cryptography had established, and because he needed another moment to haul himself down from the ledges of her high cheekbones, to retreat from the caves of her eyes. Tightening the muscles of his face, he marshaled his thoughts to Babel-17. The invasion. Babel-17 might be one key to ending this 20-year scourge. "You mean we've just been trying to decipher a lot of nonsense?" "It's not a code," she repeated. "It's a language." The general frowned. "Well, whatever you call it, code or language, we still have to figure out what it says. As long as we don't understand it, we're hell of a way from where we should be." The exhaustion and pressure of the last words homed in his belly, a secret beast to strike the back of his tongue, harshening his words. Her smile had left, and both hands were on the counter. He wanted to retract the harshness. She said, "You're not directly connected with the cryptography department." The voice was even, calming. He shook his head. "Then let me tell you this. Basically, General Forrester, there are 2 types of codes. In the first, letters or symbols that stand for letters are shuffled and juggled according to a pattern. In the second, letters, words, or groups of words are replaced by other letters, symbols, or words. A code can be one type or the other, or a combination, but both have this in common. Once you find the key, you just plug it in and out come logical sentences. A language, however, has its own internal logic, its own grammar, its own way of putting thoughts together with words that span various spectra of meaning. There is no key you can plug in to unlock the exact meaning. At best, you can get a close approximation." "Do you mean that Babel-17 decodes into some other language?" "Not at all. That's the first thing I checked. We can take a probability scan on various elements and see if they are congruent with other language patterns, even if these elements are in the wrong order. No, Babel-17 is a language itself which we do not understand." "I think," General Forrester tried to smile, What you're trying to tell me is that because it isn't a code, but rather an alien language, we might as well give up. If this were defeat, receiving it from her was almost relief. But she shook her head. I'm afraid that's not what I'm saying at all. Unknown languages have been deciphered without translations. Linear B and Hittite, for example. But if I'm to get further with Babel-17, I'll have to know a great deal more. The general raised his eyebrows. What more do you need to know? We've given you all our samples. When we get more, we'll certainly... General, I have to know everything you know about Babel-17. Where you got it, when, under what circumstances. Anything that might give me a clue to the subject matter. We've released all the information that we... You gave me 10 pages of double-spaced typewritten garble with the code name Babel-17 and asked me what it meant. With just that, I can't tell you. With more, I might. It's that simple. He thought, if it were that simple, if it were only that simple, we would never have called you in about it, Rydra Wong. She said, if it were that simple, if it were only that simple, you would never have called me in about it, General Forrester. He started, for one absurd moment convinced she had read his mind. But of course she would know that, wouldn't she? General Forrester, has your cryptography department discovered it's a language? If they have, they haven't told me. I'm fairly sure they don't know. I've made a few structural inroads on the grammar. Have they done that? No. General, although they know a hell of a lot about codes, they know nothing of the nature of language. That sort of idiotic specializations is one of the reasons I haven't worked with them for the past 6 years. Who is she? He thought again. A security dossier had been handed him that morning, but he had passed it to his aide and merely noted later that it had been marked approved. He heard himself say, Perhaps if you could tell me a little about yourself, Miss Wong, I could speak more freely with you. Illogical, yet he'd spoken it with a measured calm and surety. Was her expression quizzical? What do you want to know? What I already know is only this, your name, and that some time ago you worked for military cryptography. I know that even though you left when very young, you had enough of a reputation so that 6 years later, the people who remembered you said unanimously, after they had struggled with Babel-17 for a month, send it to Rydra Wong. He paused. And you tell me you have gotten some place with it, so they were right. Let's have drinks, she said. The bartender drifted forward, drifted back, leaving 2 small glasses of smoky green. She sipped, watching him. Her eyes, he thought, slant up like astounded wings. I'm not from Earth, she said. My father was a communications engineer at Stellar Center X11b, just beyond Uranus. My mother was a translator for the Court of Outer Worlds. Until I was 7, I was the spoiled brat of the Stellar Center. There weren't many children. We moved rockside to Uranus 27 in 52. By the time I was 12, I knew 7 Earth languages and could make myself understood in 5 extraterrestrial tongues. I pick up languages like most people pick up lyrics to popular songs. I lost both parents during the second embargo. You were on Uranus during the embargo? You know what happened? I know the outer planets were hit a lot harder than the inner. You don't know, but yes, they were. She drew a breath as memory surprised her. One drink isn't enough to make me talk about it, though. When I came out of the hospital, there was a chance I may have had brain damage. Brain damage? Malnutrition you know about, and neurosciatic plague. I know about plague, too. Anyway, I came to Earth to stay with an aunt and uncle here and receive neurotherapy. Only I didn't need it. And I don't know whether it was psychological or physiological, but I came out of the whole business with total verbal recall. I'd been bordering on it all my life, so it wasn't too odd. But I also had perfect pitch. Doesn't that usually go along with lightning calculation and eidetic memory? I can see how all of them would be of use to a cryptographer. I'm a fair mathematician, but no lightning calculator. I test high on visual conception and spatial relations, dream and technicolor and all that, but the total recall is strictly verbal. I had already begun writing. During the summer, I got a job translating with the government and began to bone up on codes. In a little while, I discovered that I had a certain knack. I'm not a good cryptographer. I don't have the patience to work that hard on anything written down that I didn't write myself. Neurotic as hell. That's another reason I gave it up for poetry. But the knack was sort of frightening. Somehow, when I had too much work to do, and somewhere else I really wanted to be, and was scared my supervisor would start getting on my back, suddenly everything I knew about communication would come together in my head, and it was easier to read the thing in front of me and say what it said than to be that scared and tired and miserable. She glanced at her drink. Eventually, the knack got to where I could control it. By then, I was 19 and had a reputation as a little girl who could crack anything. I guess it was knowing something about language that did it, being more facile at recognizing patterns, like distinguishing grammatical order from random rearrangement by feel, which is what I did with Babel-17. Why did you leave? I've given you 2 reasons. A third is simply that when I mastered the knack, I wanted to use it for my own purposes. At 19, I quit the military and, got married and started writing seriously. 3 years later, my first book came out. She shrugged, smiled. For anything after that, read the poems. It's all there. And on the worlds of 5 galaxies now, people delve your imagery and meaning for the answers to the riddles of greatness, love, and isolation. The 3 words jumped his sentence like vagabonds on a boxcar. She was before him and was great. Here, divorced from the military, he felt desperately isolated, and he was desperately no, that was impossible and ridiculous, and too simple to explain what coursed and pulsed behind his eyes, inside his hands. Another drink, automatic defense. But she will take it for automatic politeness. Will she? The bartender came, left. The worlds of 5 galaxies, she repeated. That's so strange. I'm only 26. Her eyes fixed somewhere behind the mirror. She was only half through her first drink. By the time Keats was your age, he was dead. She shrugged. This is an odd epoch. It takes heroes very suddenly, very young, then drops them as quickly. He nodded, recalling 6 singers, actors, even writers in their late teens or early 20s, who had been named genius for a year, 2, 3, only to disappear. Her reputation was only a phenomenon of 3 years' duration. I'm part of my times, she said. I'd like to transcend my times, but the times themselves have a good deal to do with who I am. Her hand retreated across the mahogany from her glass. You, in military, it must be much the same. She raised her head. Have I given you what you want? He nodded. It was easier to lie with a gesture than a word. Good. Now, General Forrester, what's Babel-17? He looked around for the bartender, but a glow brought his eyes back to her face. The glow was simply her smile, but from the corner of his eye he had actually mistaken it for a light. Here, she said, pushing her second drink, untouched, to him. I won't finish this. He took it, sipped. The invasion, Miss Wong. It's got to be involved with the invasion. She leaned on one arm, listening with narrowing eyes. It started with a series of accidents. Well, at first they seemed like accidents. Now we're sure it's sabotage. They've occurred all over the Alliance regularly since December 68. Some on warships, some in space navy yards, usually involving the failure of some important equipment. Twice, explosions have caused the death of important officials. Several times these accidents have happened in industrial plants producing essential war products. What connects all these accidents, other than that they touched on the war? With our economy working this way, it would be difficult for any major industrial accident not to affect the war. The thing that connects them all, Miss Wong, is Babel-17. He watched her finish her drink and set the glass precisely on the wet circle. Just before, during, and immediately after each accident, the area is flooded with radio exchanges back and forth from indefinite sources. Most of them only have a carrying power of a couple hundred yards, but there are occasional bursts through hyperstatic channels that blanket a few light years. We have transcribed the stuff during the last 3 accidents and given it the working title Babel-17. Now, does that tell you anything you can use? Yes, there's a good chance you're receiving the radio instructions for the sabotage back and forth between whatever is directing the accidents. But we can't find a thing. Exasperation struck. There's nothing but that blasted gobbledygook piping away at double speed. Finally, someone noticed certain repetitions in the pattern that suggested a code. Cryptography seemed to think it was a good lead, but couldn't crack it for a month. So they called you. As he talked, he watched her think. Now she said, "General Forrester, I'd like the original monitors of these radio exchanges, plus a thorough report, second by second if it's available, of those accidents timed to the tapes." "I don't know if you don't have such a report, make one during the next accident that occurs. If this radio garbage is a conversation, I have to be able to follow what's being talked about. You may not have noticed, but in the copy cryptography gave me, there was no description as to which voice is which. In short, what I'm working with now is a transcription of a highly technical exchange run together without punctuation or even word breaks." "I can probably get you everything you want except the original recordings." "You have to. I must make my own transcription carefully and on my own equipment." "We'll make a new one to your specifications." She shook her head. "I have to do it myself or I can't promise a thing. There's a whole problem of phonemic and allophonic distinctions. Your people didn't even realize it was a language, so it didn't occur to them." Now he interrupted her. "What sort of distinctions?" "You know the way some Orientals confuse the sounds of R and L when they speak a Western language? That's because R and L in many Eastern languages are allophones, that is, considered the same sound, written and even heard the same, just like the TH at the beginning of they and at the beginning of theater." "What's different about the sound of theater and they?" "Say them again and listen. One's voiced and the other's unvoiced. They're as distinct as V and F, only they're allophones in English and you're used to hearing them as if they were the same phoneme." "Oh." "But you see the problem a foreigner has transcribing a language he doesn't speak. He may come out with too many distinctions of sound or not enough." "How do you propose to do it?" "By what I know about the sound systems of a lot of other languages, and by feel." "The knack again?" She smiled. "I suppose." She waited for him to grant approval. What wouldn't he have granted her? For a moment he had been distracted by her voice through subtleties of sound. "Of course, Miss Wong," he said. "You're our expert. Come to cryptography tomorrow and you can have access to whatever you need." "Thank you, General Forrester. I'll bring my official report in then." He stood in the static beam of her smile. "I must go now," he thought desperately. "Oh, let me say something to her." "Fine, Miss Wong. I'll speak to you then." Something more, something... He wrenched his body away. I must turn from her. "Say one thing more. Thank you. Be you. Love you." He walked to the door, his thoughts quieting. Who is she? Oh, the things that should have been said. I have been brusque, military, efficient, but the luxuriance of thought and word I would have given her. The door stayed open, and evening brushed blue fingers on his eyes. My God, he thought as coolness struck his face. All that inside me, and she doesn't know. I didn't communicate a thing. Somewhere in the depths, the words, not a thing, you're still safe. But stronger on the surface was the outrage at his own silence. Didn't communicate a thing at all. Rydra stood up, her hands on the edge of the counter, looking at the mirror. The bartender came to remove the glasses at her fingertips. As he reached for them, he frowned. "Miss Wong?" Her face was fixed. "Miss Wong, are you?" Her knuckles were white, and as the bartender watched, the whiteness crept along her hands, till they looked like shaking wax. "Is there something wrong, Miss Wong?" She snapped her face toward him. "You know." Read for The Akashic Record by Carter Epperly.